Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really intricate theological discourse. We are going to build, essentially, an architectural blueprint of reality. We're going to trace this incredibly fascinating line of thought from our source material, taking us all the way from the absolute unseeable essence of God, right down to the actual chemical balances inside human biology. It's quite a journey, so let's get right into it. Let's kick things off with a huge philosophical question that's going to guide our whole exploration today. What happens when humanity becomes the ultimate measure of all things? Now, I know, on the surface, that sounds pretty empowering, right? But as we dive into the source material, we find an argument that placing humans at the absolute center of the universe actually creates this profound disruption in how we value life and ultimately how we understand truth. To navigate this, we'll follow a precise 6-step map. We'll go through understanding Allah, the categories of existence, truth versus relativity, competing paradigms, the distant God fallacy, and finally, the human mirror. Okay, Section 1. Understanding the focal point of reality. Any architectural blueprint needs a solid center. And in this framework, that center is the concept of marifatullah. This translates to the continuous pursuit of understanding and knowing God. Now, the source points out something really crucial here. The human mind actually cannot grasp the absolute essence of a necessary being. Our brains literally just aren't wired for it. So marifatullah isn't about solving a math equation and being done with it. It's a vital, continuous intellectual journey. And it acts as the prerequisite for understanding the very laws of the universe. Because our brains heavily rely on concrete concepts, grasping the absolute abstract directly is basically impossible. So the text uses this beautiful metaphor. Think of the Esma, the divine attributes like mercy or justice, as a magnificent climbing rope extended from the sky. We use these attributes to pull ourselves up, hand over hand, toward that abstract understanding. Moving right along to Section 2, the 3 tiers of existence. Notice how existence is separated into very strict boundaries here. First, we have the absolute or necessary existence, then the contingent or possible existence, which includes us, right? Humans and all of nature. And finally, the impossible existence, which is just absolute nothingness. The argument emphasizes that this rigid categorization completely neuters any concept of pantheism. The absolute is kept completely and fundamentally distinct from the contingent. You just can't blur those lines. But you might be wondering, if this absolute existence is the foundation of everything, why can't we see it? Well, imagine staring directly into a blinding welding machine. You experience temporary blindness, right? But not because there's no light. Actually, it's because the light is simply too intense for the biological limits of your eyes. In the exact same way, the absolute existence is unseen precisely because of the sheer, overwhelming intensity of its presence. All right, on to Section 3, the clash of truth and relativity. When the source examines ancient Greek sophism, or even modern postmodernism, that whole idea of your truth is your truth and my truth is mine, it points out a massive mathematical paradox. Think about it. A world with over 6 billion individual, highly subjective truths effectively has 0 actual truth. And the consequences of this absolute relativity, they're pretty severe. If truth is entirely relative, the very foundation for moral behavior and justice absolutely collapses. You lose the entire distinction between good and evil. According to this framework, even the great moral battles of history, like Moses standing up against the Pharaoh, they just get reduced to meaningless differences of opinion. Without an absolute metric, there's literally no boundary left to protect. Let's move to Section 4 to see how these competing philosophical paradigms actually map out. Looking at these 2 worldviews, the source highlights a really stark contrast. In the Islamic paradigm presented here, the hierarchy flows from God to human to nature. So human beings derive their intrinsic value from a divine source. But contrast this with the Western or Greek paradigm, which places the human at the top, followed by nature and then God. The argument made here is that when humanity places itself at the top as the ultimate measure of all things, we essentially create and define our own gods. It totally shifts value away from a transcendent, absolute source. Following that human-centric worldview, the text uncovers what it calls the reductionist triad. It's basically a systematic stripping away of spiritual value. First, you have Darwin, reducing human existence to purely biological animalism. Then Freud comes along, reducing human psychological motivation down to libido and base instincts. And finally, Marx, who reduces human history to mere material conflicts, basically a fight for bones and meat. Suddenly, the human being is viewed strictly through this incredibly cold material lens. The danger of this reductionism is punctuated with a genuinely chilling anecdote from the text. It mentions a Danish university student who became a serial killer after adopting this exact extreme materialist mindset. The story goes that before committing his crimes, he literally wore a shirt that read, "Humanity is given too much value." When you strip away divine value, you risk viewing humans merely as meat and clothes, which is exactly how a dog would see them. It's a really stark warning about the total loss of inherent human dignity. This brings us to Section 5, the distant God fallacy. To really understand ancient paganism, we have to ask a deeply logical question. Why on earth did societies that actually acknowledged a supreme creator, societies that totally believed God sent the rain and made the earth, why did they still build statues out of stone and wood? Well, the core thesis here is a concept called the distant God belief. The foundational error of ancient paganism wasn't that they denied a creator. Not at all. It was believing that this creator was incredibly distant, detached, and entirely removed from daily human life. It's this idea that, sure, God is a supreme being, but he's simply way too far away to care about your specific, everyday problems. It is absolutely fascinating to look at the mechanics of this, specifically among Meccan polytheists. Because they viewed God as totally inaccessible, they created female idols, like Lat, Menet, and Uzza. They imagined them as divine intermediaries, or even, and this is wild, as God's harem. They were basically applying base human logic to the divine. To persuade a distant king, you have to appease his inner circle first. So they required this entirely fabricated system of statues and rituals just to bridge a gap that only existed in their own minds. And finally, Section 6, the human mirror. To completely dismantle that distant God fallacy, the source looks at how intimately the divine is mirrored in our physical reality. Think of Jalal, which represents majesty and protective anger. We see this embodied in the wolf or the thorn on a plant. Now contrast that with Jamal, representing beauty and calm, embodied in the sheep or the rose. The point here is that even anger has a divine purpose. It's a necessary protective force against injustice. It shows that majesty and beauty must coexist perfectly, just like the rose and its thorn. And get this macrocosmos is remarkably reflected right inside the microcosms of our own bodies. Classical Islamic scholars actually noted that even the chemical balance of our organs, specifically the gallbladder, dictates human temperament. A high chemical balance creates an active, quickly angered protector type. A lower balance creates a highly calm, passive peacemaker. It's crazy, but our very biology is literally tuned to reflect these diverse divine attributes. So the huge takeaway here is that human diversity is absolutely not an accident of nature. The fact that some of us are naturally fiery and others are naturally gentle, it's described as a divine division of labor. Society desperately needs both the fierce protectors who are going to stand up against injustice and the gentle peacemakers who hold our communities together. It is a perfectly calibrated system reflecting the exact names of God through human action. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a deeply personal question to think about regarding your own worldview. Based on the entire architectural blueprint we've just explored, are you constantly searching for meaning and a distant God through external intermediaries? Or are you looking within, recognizing a reality that is fundamentally closer to you than your own jugular vein? The answer to that question really changes how you measure the whole world. Thanks for joining me today.